And now I want to invite our research fellow, Brigadier General Erez Maisel. Erez Maisel, Brigadier General, IDF Reserve, vast experience in strategic planning, international relations, and security diplomacy, and is a hands-on participator in international conflict prevention and boundary management. His last position in the IDF was the head of the Foreign Relations Division. A native of Northern Israel who made Aliyah from South Africa, today Erez is joining us to present the research that he made here. Brigadier Maisel is also a co-founder of the Technion Institution in Haifa Research Center, BRDG, Boundary Research and Deconfliction Group, which is, by the way, a new think tank, and I wish it a great success. I think it's a very interesting and important topic. Brigadier General Erez Maisel, as I've said, wrote 2 in-depth research and analysis reports, one about the demography, part of it I just presented, and the other one was in order to understand better what happened here in May. So Erez, I invite you now to share with us your presentation. Let's see.
Yeah, so thank you very much for that kind introduction and for the opportunity to present. Nadia, good evening to you too, and Ibrahim. Long time no see, it's good to see you. This is an interesting picture that you can see over here. This picture is taken just above the what's called the Valley of Sakhnin. The picture itself is in a village of Arabe, and this is looking down into the valley itself, and I'll get to that in a second. The subtitle for this presentation is Mapping Arab Friction Points, Arab Elite Tailwinds, and I'll get to that in a second. Basically, it means influencing Arab leadership, but they seem to have influenced in a negative way some of the violence. Local opportunity driven, which is most of the violence was local opportunity along routes and such like, and this whole question of the Generation Z, the generation, what we call now Generation Z, those born between 1996 and 2000, 2005, what we call now first digital natives, and this whole question how they deal with frustrations, of course, and other things. I'm going to what we call bluff, which is the bottom lines up front. I'm talking about, first and foremost, as Sarit mentioned, we're all destined to live here together. We really don't have any other choice. I'm not sure we want another choice. I'm going to talk about 3 main issues as I go through the slides. First of all, this question of Arab leadership accountability. In the article itself, I speak about, I quote Mansour Abbas, who quoted someone else, of course, about do you want the God, do you want to fight the God, or do you want to eat the grapes when you come to a vineyard? And this whole question of promoting engagement with the Israeli government by the Arab leadership, we see it now in turning Arab politics as well between the 2 main parties, of course. On the one hand, engagement led by the Knesset member Mansour versus, I would say, his opponents in that in the internal political environment. The other question I mentioned is this whole question of the Zoomers themselves, frustration and violence. And the most important point coming out of the research, I mean, there's still much to be done about that, and of course to answer some of those questions, is acknowledge the gaps themselves, not ignore it. And I think most of us understand that. But more importantly is to focus on the young males themselves, which I think in many years has been neglected, and that's becoming more and more of a problem. And third and foremost, you can't understand what happened here in the Galilee without looking at how the Israeli police reacted and what they did and how their behavior also impacted what happened over here. And we speak about rebalancing for presence, which is engagement, of course, and reconfiguring the way the police actually basically enable freedom of movement of all of us, all northern residents on the routes themselves. And before I actually get into the presentation itself, I want to speak speak a moment of humility, as we say, and warning as well. All of this is based on what we call open source, which is basically out there in the social media, and some of it has been field collected as well, if during the events themselves or a couple of days later. But the presentation itself and the research that you can find on the site is much more than a landscape, but it's a little bit finer than an impression. You still have much work to do. What I'm basically putting out here is the trends themselves, and I'm also sort of highlighting where we should look at the other issues as well. What I will not go into And I think Nadia and Ibrahim may get into some of these things. And when we go to the Q&A, I'm not going to talk about the question of identity. I'm also not going to talk about the question of the Jewish communities themselves in the North. These are givens. Identity questions in the Jewish community, the Jewish people living in the North, that's there. We have to deal with that, much like we have the Arabs, Muslims, and Christians, Cherkessim or Druze. That's given, and we have to now work around it. I'm also not going to get into the question of Jerusalem. I will slightly mention it. Although in the report itself, I do talk about Jerusalem, how that impacted. You can't ignore it, but it will not be the center of this presentation. And I will also, this time, not speak about Accra, the diversified or mixed city in the north, and what happened over there. That really, we don't have enough time for that, and that requires specifically a little bit, I would say, finer research, and also looking at some other, I would say, topics to investigate. So I'll leave those out, and I still think you'll be able to get a very good understanding of what we understand what happened here in May. So my aim, objective, and my method. So first of all, knowledge is power. That's the most important thing for all of us. That is the police, the young generation, Jews and Arab, and of course leadership, Jews and Arabs. The basic aim is why did this happen? And what we would like to try and do is prevent further violent waves in the Galilee. As we all know, there was one in 2000 as well, and there have been smaller ones between 2000 and 2021 as well. The objective of the presentation will be basically to tell the story itself with a couple of slides, a couple of pictures as well. And the method, that's the most important thing, because there's been a very stringent and in-depth research, is how did we create the database, we looked at the past, and how did we identify the points of friction themselves, which basically when we talk about friction, we're speaking about points of conflict or some kind of clash. So first and foremost, as Sarit mentioned, I've prepared and Alma has produced 3 reports on, I would say, trends, demographies, and what's some of the issues that are really of interest to Jews and Arabs living in the north. And we've put it all on a map, really. This is a demographic map of the Galilee itself. We then divided into 4 clusters. The clusters are based on ethnographic and some sort of, I would say, links between the different settlements and communities and villages and cities. This enabled us then to try and look at, where are the friction points, where are the points we need to look at, and what do we need to deal with in the future as well. There are 8 clusters altogether, looking at the different ethnographic in the Galilee. We have basically, I would say, we have 1, 4, 5, and 3 and 8 clusters are in Lower Galilee, which is where the most of the incidents occurred, and then 5 and 6 and 7 are in the Upper Galilee. That's just to say what we're talking about. As I mentioned, we're not going to barely talk about Akka, and we're not going to talk about Haifa this time as well. Regarding the method, the collection itself was done from social media, Arab, English, and Hebrew. It was all then collated into an Excel spreadsheet. We divided into 4 friction levels. Green, a demonstration, normally peaceful, and normally would have a license as well from the police. Yellow, 2 would be an obstruction of the routes itself or the routes. That could be some sort of obstacle put there, or possibly some stones, of course, thrown, and we'll get to that in a second. 3 in orange is actual property damage. That is that maybe a police station was damaged or a car was damaged. And physical harm is basically people were wounded. In the Galilee, not talking about Akka again, people were only wounded, but they were wounded badly. We're talking about incidents that happened along the roads. When we looked at the spreadsheet itself, we divided into where it happened, when it happened, of course, what it happened, and we also divided into the clusters themselves. And the result of all of that was we collated it onto, we put it all in together in an Excel spreadsheet. We looked at, so what happened? What happened between the 8th of May and the 18th of May, and specifically from the 10th of May to the 18th of May. So the 10th of May was Jerusalem Day, those who may have forgotten already. Jerusalem Day is a day that many people in Israel go to Jerusalem, and they basically celebrate I would say the undivision or the joining of Jerusalem. This year was specifically very, very tense, following about over 2-3 weeks of what we call the TikTok incidents and such like things. This was also at the end of Ramadan. That happens nearly every year. And this year it was very, very tense. Jerusalem Day, if that wasn't enough, to have those, I would say, every year or annual issues out there and specific tensions, Jerusalem Day, there was also a threat by Hamas that they threatened that if the Jerusalem Day celebrations happened, they would try and stop them. That was the threat. And when during the celebrations, something did happen over there, a rocket was fired from the Gaza Strip towards Jerusalem. The IDF dealt with the rocket. There was no damage. But that in many ways was the kickoff point, I would say, for what happened from the 10th to the 18th. And that's basically the week plus of Galilean violence that I will deal with, what I'm calling the Galilean violence wave. So from the 10th to the 15th, we saw 6 days of concentrated violence. And the first day was the 10th. And in the report itself, we go, I would say, blow by blow, if you want, to point by point of where the violence was, where it occurred. But you can basically see that on the 10th, there was very few demonstrations. There was a little bit of obstruction of routes themselves, but it started the trend. And there were some casualties on the roads. But the main day was the following day, or the 11th, what the leadership, Arab leadership, political leadership called Day of Rage. Not the first time. It was a lot of demonstrations. We counted over 20, but I believe there were much more. And again, we're talking only of the Galilee, that is from Nazareth north. And there was some obstruction, which we had seen before, but now there was slightly more. And again, there were some cases of fatalities along the routes themselves. This trend continued all the way between 12 and 13. As you can see, the obstruction, the property damage was the main trend. It happened mainly at night. And I'll get to that in a second, exactly on the map where that happened. On the 14th, well, now on Friday, it was Nakba Day. So you can see it was really a very, very tense time. In the Ramadan, Eid al-Fitr, we have the Operation Guardian of Walls, the IDF operation in Gaza itself, against Hamas. And Nakba Day again organized demonstrations. Some, by the way, nearly all of them ended peacefully. But again, that night, obstruction of routes and some property damage against cars. That followed Shabbat, Sabbath, slightly less demonstrations. Some demonstrations during this time, what I would say that Jewish and Arab demonstrations together, also quite a few on Friday. People started to go out against this and basically demonstrate against the violence themselves to support coexistence. But that night again, roads were blocked and there was property damage. Shavuot, the holiday, the Jewish holiday, we did not find any events in the north. The 17th was just property damage. It was some rocks were thrown, some stones were thrown against the vehicle. And then basically the wave of violence ended with an Arab general strike, not the first time, of course, but an Arab general strike, which was basically, I would say, was very widespread. And we noted just under 10 demonstrations, organized demonstrations that ended peacefully, and basically that ended the wave of violence, which ended those 6 days, and of course the total of 10 days. I'm now going to just explain slightly with a couple of pictures where this happened. So one of the zones you can see on the left-hand side, by the way, of the presentation, I used again our pie map just to show where it is in Israel. So this is on the way between, I would say, between Haifa and the Golani Junction. This is the village of Kfar Kana. There were a couple of incidents here of stone throwing, and at least one incident of somebody wounded due to his vehicle being struck by stones. You can understand how close, when I speak about opportunities, you can understand just how close this village, it's a very big village, is quite close to the road. And therefore the opportunity of those who chose to do it to create havoc on the routes, to block the routes, and to basically cause damage. I'm going to show a couple of slides of the damage themselves and what was done. This is from the village of Kfar Manda. You can see where it is. It's just north of Kfar Kana. This is the morning after. This is somebody was driving to work and he took this picture. It's all of open source, of course. This is from Route 784. This Kfar Manda has passed, as they say, of serious violence. Although I would say that it's not always like this, but this was very, very rough. You can see that someone put a mattress here and they were using tires as well. During the night, this road was closed down completely. In the morning, you can see people try to find their way through. This continued, Kvalmanda continued for nearly every night between the nights that we reported on. This is another incident in the village of Iblin. It's not very far from where I live, by the way. You can see on the left-hand side the roadblocks themselves, and these are people trying to get around the roadblocks. You can just make out some of the masked men just next to that orange sign, to the left of the orange sign. And they were basically trying to identify Jewish drivers. On the right-hand side, the morning after, you can see the damage that was done. Just before May, there a lot of work was being done on this road to make it much more safer, and also to add lighting, highway lighting. And, the rioters had bent this lighting and cut it down to use that as roadblocks. And you can see the morning after, people are trying to get around these roadblocks. This is the village of Kauka Belhija. This is even more north now. You can see it's near a police station, and you can see where the tires themselves are basically blocking the road, very, very close to the village themselves. Basically, the young people walked from the village, walked down to the road, lit the tires, and these would burn for a very long time, of course, completely closing the road. The Israeli police's reaction to all these roadblocks was basically to not allow any Jewish traffic to go through. And this also continued for nearly all the nights until the 14th, 15th, where they started to actually deal with these problems, with these roadblocks. But 4 nights running, nothing happened. So what do we understand? And this is very important looking at the future, because we need to think about preventing this. We understand that there's a problem. We understand that there's what I'm calling tailwind, influenced by Arab leadership, some Arab leadership in Israel, the demonstrations, and some of the sound bites that came out of that. Again, there are frustrations. We're also speaking about the impact of COVID-19. Many young people went home. Some students, of course, were not at university or at college. They were at home. There's, of course, the impact of unemployment as well. And as it is, there is a youth bulge in the north, not only in the north amongst the Arabs, but specifically I'm speaking about the Galilee. And when you look at the result, you can see that out of the 8 clusters, basically the northern clusters were not that violent. Demonstrations, I would say it's a given right, it's a democratic right, specifically when they were coordinated with the lights of the police, which most of them were. And even when they weren't, they were basically organized and peaceful. But they led to something else, which is this property damage and obstruction, and in some cases even the casualties. You can see that most of the violence during May is located in what we call the lower Galilee, specifically in clusters 2 and 3. You can see there's quite a few incidents there of casualties, of people wounded from stone throwing. In one incident in cluster 3, somebody made a mistake. A Jewish driver tried to get around these roadblocks and drove through an Arab village, and was basically attacked very, very seriously. But he was also, I'll get to that towards the end of my presentation, he was also, I would say, rescued by Arab residents who pulled him out of the car. But of course, he was attacked by other residents. The other point that this map makes very clear is, we marked it in red, is the routes themselves, what we call the block roads themselves. And these are very, very important roads. Either they are leading north to south, east to west, our main roads, and some of the roads themselves are leading to Jewish communities, Jewish villages themselves. They were blocked, such as in Iblin or Kauka Belhija or Kvalmanda. But others like Falkana and areas like around the Bir Maksur or Zarzir, these areas are also closed as well, impacting freedom of movement of everyone really, but specifically the Jewish residents of the Galilee. But towards the end, as I mentioned in that the chronology that I presented, there were other demonstrations as well. This is now the 18th. This is that main general Arab strike. And this is I would say, a peaceful demonstration. No blocking. You can see actually around the roundabout where the tires were lit for those 5 days running. You can see the smudge marks on the road, not far from the petrol station, which of course is dangerous. But this is a peaceful demonstration, and I think in many ways it says, how do we move from here? Where are we going to? Okay, there was the violence. I didn't get into all the question of how and what mobilized the rioters themselves, but the question is, how do we move from here? How do we go forward? So this is a very important shot from that. I also want to mention, as I mentioned before, yes, there was this near lynching of the Jewish man in the village of Tamra, not that far from where I live, but he was rescued by other Arab citizens that live there. It shouldn't have happened, and I don't want to talk too much about it. It must have been horrific for him, but he was rescued, and he made it very clear afterwards on the media that he was saved by Arab citizens. He made it very clear, and then from there he was transferred to an ambulance that evacuated him to a hospital. Looking ahead, this question of Israeli police and where were they for some of the time, I think that they were very surprised. Not only all of us were surprised, not all of us were shocked. I think they were very surprised. And this is a question we need to look at in the future, how they change their posture, how they change the whole concept, I would say, about how it's not only about, now there's a lot of talk about, finding arms and all that. It's much more than finding illegal arms. It's this question of, policing, community policing, how you create credibility and how you engage with the people themselves. The picture over here is of the Deputy Commissioner Jamal Khakroush. His home actually was fired on about 3 months after this. We're talking about in October. He lives, by the way, in Kfar Kana. And they found apparently the people that fired at him, and it seems to be related to criminal activity, as you can read over here from Times of Israel from the 11th of November. But this question is, it's not enough that we have a deputy commissioner policeman. The question is, what are the police actually doing, or how are we moving ahead to prevent that? Not to react, but to prevent. Another, I would say, we look ahead, and I mentioned that from the beginning, is this Arab political leadership in Israel. And this window appears to be a window. Hopefully it will be pragmatic, and hopefully it will lead. It's not only for the Arab political leadership to be pragmatic and engage, of course, but it also says something about the Israeli government, which, as far as I can see, is very aware of that and is choosing to engage. I mean, we saw a large investment in developing Arab society. We're talking over 30 billion shekels. Compared to the previous plan, that there was a lot of money over there, 17 billion, but a lot of it, unfortunately, was not actually utilized. Hopefully this will be much better. And I think in many ways it will be much better, because the Arab leadership, specifically my member of Knesset Mansour, there, by the way, his picture is taken. He was a couple of days after the riots in Lod, in Layada, which is not in the north, of course, it's near Tel Aviv. He chose to come there and speak about coexistence. And this picture was taken, by the way, in the synagogue that had been damaged, and he chose to speak there for Channel 1 in Israel, Channel 11. So this question is, how do we use this window? How do we leverage this opportunity? Because I think we all understand that we are destined to live together. Really, that's just what it is. And now the question is how we move ahead. First question, leadership. Second question, dealing with Arab young people's frustrations and fulfillment. And third but not least, this question of rule of law in the state of Israel. So bottom lines, I think that the report makes it very clear that all violence actually is local. It's very easy to talk a general picture about, everybody. It's like saying, all Israelis Jews, all Israeli Arabs. There's many different kinds out there and many different opinions. But I think more than anything else, I think the research we did shows that not only is Arab leadership bifurcated, there are engagers versus degraders, but also the actual landscape is very split. There's a big division out there. We saw some villages, a city like Sakhnin, hardly any violence. In fact, limited violence, demonstrations, yes, but nothing. Although there is a past there from the late 70s, but leadership obviously can control it, and they were able to manage this and frame it differently compared to Kfar Kama or Kfar Manda. The question of Arab Generation Z or Zoomers, this question of violent mobilization, it appears it's compounded. It's not only about identity. It's not only about Islam. It's not only about issues that are, I would call them political. It's also about economics, of course, although it's also about frustration, about fulfillment. It's about people are very aware today of the capabilities, of the opportunities, and they would like to make use of them. They would like to get ahead, as let's say. And in the reports that we presented, and it's on the Alma site themselves, we speak about these questions of, housing and other issues, employment. But it's not only, by the way, for the Arabs living in the north, it's for the Jews living in the north as well. Everybody's dealing with similar questions. So the question is, how do you deal with these things? So I think that the bottom line about this violent mobilization, which I say is compounded, and I elaborate in the report there, that it's not all about identity, and it's not all about unemployment and need. That means it's that grouping of people that are either not employed, not educated, or not being trained. And third but not least is this question of credibility for the police and developing situational awareness. That if they understand what's happening, they are engaging. I believe that many policemen knew what was happening, but the question is, what kind of process is out there? What kind of system is there? What are you dealing with to basically persistently prevent this from happening? How do you deal with it, and how do you engage with the people themselves, and how do you see the community as an opportunity and not necessarily as a challenge? So I think I've basically been longer than I was told to be, and I apologize. Again, the full report is on the site. It's not very long, and again, I mentioned there are pictures. So I thank you very much for your patience and attention. And I'm sure that when we get to the Q&A, I'll be more than happy to answer any questions and receive any comments and insights. Thank you very much. And again, Sarif, thank you for the opportunity.